What we feared would happen has indeed happened, and this new development really cements Imu as the final boss of One Piece. Because if even a man such as Rox Tizebek, a man of ancient ties and significance, has fallen prey to Imu's Domi Reversi, then what hope is left for anyone else? Imu's ability feels unfair in the sense that it doesn't care about strength, reputation, or even haki. That's what makes Domi Reversi so concerning going forward. How do you stand up to a technique that doesn't operate on the usual rules of anything we know within the One Piece world? Well, that's exactly what we're looking at today. We are looking closely at Domi Reversi, explore how it might actually work, what are its conditions, its limits, and perhaps, most importantly, how do we defeat it? So let's go back to the first time we saw this ability being used. In chapter 1150, in present time Elbaf, with the transformation of Dory and Broggy. Back then, we saw Imu produce an abyss-like mark, a magic circle, and Broggy was actually seen to fall through this magic circle, and we also saw Imu calling out an incantation out of a magic book, also known as a grimoire, which is a word that actually derives from the word grammatica in Latin, because traditionally, magic books or grimoires were written in Latin and required an understanding of grammatical knowledge to read and interpret the book. And that's quite important in understanding the name of the spell or the attack name, the ritual, however you want to call it, Domi Reversi. Domi Reversi is actually a Latin phrase, and when translated to English means return home. And this has resulted in quite the popular speculation amongst the fanbase that a condition for the Domi Reversi attack is that it can only work on individuals who are the citizens of the island where the attack is being used. That's why only the Elbafian giants are seen being turned back in chapter 1150, and so far as we've seen in the God Valley flashback, Rox, who does indeed hail from God Valley, and his fellow Davy D family are the only ones who we've seen being affected. And this would be pretty clever if true, because then it's a very clear limitation to what is otherwise an overpowered ability. In Rox's case, it is extremely bad luck, or shall we say, an intensely dark twist of fate that he ended up back at God Valley, but it could also explain why the attack is unlikely to be a huge problem when it comes to future matchups against Imu. For example, Shanks wouldn't be affected because God Valley supposedly no longer exists. If Blackbeard is originally from Lulusia as it's heavily suggested, then he also has no hometown. And in Luffy's case, well, I think it's highly unlikely that the fight against Imu will take place at Fusha Village. But I've also seen people mention that this also could be huge as to how it could explain Roger's action in the story. In fact, the reason why the series exists in the first place. Let's say that after witnessing what happened with Rox, it's possible that Roger eventually found out how Domi Reversi works. For example, from Joy Boy's message at Laughtale, we know that Roger knew he didn't have long to live anyways, and he could have chosen to stay with Rouge and his unborn child, enjoying his last days quietly in the arms of his loved one. Instead, what does Roger choose to do? He chooses to turn himself in, knowing it will lead to a public execution which he uses as a stage to herald in the golden age of piracy, sending thousands of people out to sea to look for the One Piece. In other words, he prompts thousands of people to leave their homelands. Because if leaving your hometown is one way to weaken Imu's control over you, Roger's decision might have been more than just going out with a bang. It could have been a way to shake the foundation of Imu's world order by encouraging movement, exploration, and independence, pushing people away from the roots that would make them a target to Imu's demonic grasp. And I really like this idea, and it also got me thinking, what if this starts to explain other characters' actions and motivations, like Dragon and Yasop, for example. These two cop a lot of flack for being two of the worst deadbeat dads in the series, but what if their reason for leaving their hometown, rarely visiting their child, is because they know of Imu's ability and never wanted to be vulnerable to being turned against their own child? Monkey D. Dragon? Maybe leaving Luffy and the East Blue was strategic. Yasop might have left Syrup Village after being warned of Imu's ability by Shanks. There's even a scene in chapter 0 of One Piece where Shanks asked Usopp to join his crew, and sure, this scene was just showing us the future Straw Hats Islands of origins, but this could also be Oda hinting that Usopp's origins itself mattered in the grand scheme of things. And if we think of what counts as home in the context of Domi Reversi as an island physically tied to the ocean floor or landmass, then we could even extrapolate and apply this idea to Zou, because Zou is constantly moving on Zunesh's back with no fixed coordinates, giving it no permanent anchor, meaning that there's no clear return home point for Imu's ability to target. Or Madame Charlie's prophecy that Luffy is destined to destroy Fishman Island, and why Joy Boy promised to move the entire fishermen from their homes, making the destruction of Fishman Island breaking their origin anchor so that Imu's threat would no longer apply. Or alternatively, it could also explain why the world government started constructing the mega bridges like Tequila Wolf as an easy way of transportation to take people back to their homelands so that Imu could control them. Ships and the sea give people too much freedom to drift away from their origins, but bridges would eventually connect islands by land, making it much easier to send people back to the place that the world government wants them anchored to. The bridges aren't just pieces of infrastructure, they could be tools for control. And I'm sure there are heaps more examples of where this homeland limitation could work with what we already know about the One Piece world, so please do drop down your examples down below. And while you're doing that, if you're enjoying the discussion so far, then make sure to subscribe as well. We are so close to 100,000 subscribers. I'd really appreciate your help in getting there. We're so close to the JoyFleet getting to 100,000 subscribers, and I'd really appreciate your help getting there. But in this sense, I do have to say that I find this home island limitation idea very compelling, but let's also consider some other interpretations or other possibilities. Because while the phrase return home can be understood or interpreted quite literally, there are also more figurative interpretations that could also fit more with Imu's demonic portrayal. When we consider that Domi Reversi seems to be one of the spells from Imu's grimoire, a magic book full of incantations, and Imu themselves is heavily devil-coded, then some other more metaphorical interpretations could be that Domi Reversi means return the soul to its rightful domain, the domain being potentially connected to this idea of another world or realm, and Imu could be ordering their targets to return to the demonic realm. After all, when we saw the power being used back in chapter 1150, we saw it being used alongside a magic circle very similar to the Abyss, and if we consider that the Abyss is a magic portal through which individuals can teleport, it's possible that the magic circle we saw back in Elbaf is a portal through which individuals are teleported not just geographically between islands, but between realms. And we also have to remember what Imu says as they use the power in chapter 1150. They say that the only living form that's worth existing is the demon form. And I think this could be really interesting because then this would introduce a whole new idea of another realm, of a demon realm, something that's quite new to the series and we haven't explored fully. I mean, we do have things like the Miro world, which could be quite similar in the sense that it's another dimension that can only be entered via the Mira no Mi. And then there is also the astral world or the heavenly world in Elbaf, so there could very well be a demonic world or a demonic realm. But even more so than this meaning evil or devil per se, I actually quite like thinking about it as if Imu is commanding their target to return to your primordial self. So I talked about this after chapter 1162 in my discussion about the world and Imu being the world, which of course is an idea that popped up again in chapter 1163 with Imu talking about the world that they're trying to create. But if Imu is the world, then that could be interpreted to mean that Imu is the primordial being, an ancient being that has existed from the very beginning. And when I think about primordial beings, one of the first that comes to mind is Ymir, the progenitor of all giants according to Norse mythology. But despite being a primordial entity, Ymir is not considered a god and is actually often referred to as the devil. So this concept of a demonic, beastly, primordial being may be what Oda is heavily leaning on when it comes to the Domi Reversi form. Domi Reversi could be more metaphorically interpreted as meet your maker, reverse to your most base, your most original self, that form being a demonic primordial form, one with limited consciousness, one with limited morals. But unfortunately, thinking about it this way doesn't necessarily help us come up with limitations or constraints to this ability. I guess a condition could be that the target, the individual, must have strong ancestry or strong strong ties to their original forms. For example, only full-blooded giants like the Elbathians rather than those of mixed heritage such as the Buccaneers, or only those races and clans who have deep historical ties to their ancestry like the Davy D clan members. One condition I really like the idea of is from this comment: what if Imu can only use this against individuals who don't have devil fruits? Because that does certainly fit with the list of victims that we've seen so far. As far as we know, none of the Elbathian giants who have turned, most notably Dory and Broggy, have devil fruits. Also, equally, Rox, as far as we know, didn't yet have a devil fruit, and I think this would become a much more compelling argument if we also witnessed Roger and Garp turn versus Kaido and Big Mom remaining unaffected. And who knows, maybe we will see that in chapters to come, although personally I do think that's somewhat unlikely because I think we're all expecting Garp and Roger to be the ones to stop the demonic Rox. But I do like this idea because it could also explain why Imu is so afraid of Joy Boy. If Joy Boy was a figure who had the powers of the Nika Devil Fruit, as it is being highly suggested in the series, then he could have been immune to Imu's Domi Reversi attack. In fact, thinking about it this way, it could even be why the Ancient Kingdom developed Devil Fruits in the first place, to be a counter to such an overwhelming ability. But something I think that is not getting mentioned enough and that we're almost all forgetting is that Domi Reversi is also called that because it's also a play on the game Reversi or the game Othello. That's why we saw in chapter 1150 the giants that found themselves between Dory and Broggy were also turned, because that's a classic rule within the Reversi game. Pieces flip when they're caught between the opponent's pieces. Oda even dedicated a few panels to explicitly show us that Imu's ability is playing out much like the game. And of course, this isn't the first time that we've seen the Reversi game appear in One Piece. Back in Wano, the Reversi game was being played by the Cypher Pole agents, and back then I think we all just thought it made sense in the context of Wano, where the Beast Pirates were all given names based on card games, and card games aren't exactly a board game like Othello or Reversi is, but still. Plus, there is also a Japanese version of Reversi called Go, and so the Cypher Pole agents playing this game as a metaphor for the strategy, that all made thematic sense. But now, rather than those panels just being relevant to the thematic designs of the Wano arc, now it seems like Oda was hinting at Reversi as a key element concerning Imu, which makes sense for CP0 as agents who personally do the bidding of the world government. It's quite genius, really, one of those classic aha moments when you look back, go back to earlier chapters with hindsight. In any case, remembering that Domi Reversi is also partly named that way as a reference to the game could also help us come up with some other conditions or limitations. For example, cornering your opponent's target piece and sandwiching them is a condition for you to be able to flip their piece so it changes colors to your side in the game, which again is partly also how the attack in Imu's case seems to work, but maybe it really is also a condition whereby Imu must somehow flank or corner their target. Imu's victim must be cornered, whether that be physically or psychologically. You know, in the case of Rox, we see him getting stabbed from two sides by Imu, almost like he's being flanked, and yet we see that Rox exclaims that it doesn't seem to physically affect him, says doesn't hurt, doesn't itch, and so perhaps this was just Imu acting out the required steps of flanking or sandwiching Rox. After all, we did see Roger's crewmate saying something similar after being supposedly hit by Imu. They say that the pain that they feel is oddly compelling. Maybe we'll see in future chapters that they're the first ones to turn. Whereas in chapter 1150, we saw Imu using the magic circle to transform Broggy, and perhaps what Imu was doing is flanking Broggy in between themselves and the magic circle. Because I did find it extremely curious that we didn't see the magic circle in chapter 1163, and although it's possible that this chapter just skipped over the part where Imu produces the circle and even the grimoire because we've seen it all before, now I'm also thinking it is possible that the magic circles aren't necessarily a condition to the attack. Maybe the condition is simply that the victim is flanked, that they're sandwiched, and it may not matter too much on what Imu uses to flank the opponents, or at least there are a number of things that can work to flank your opponent. Imu themselves could act as a flanking force, as we saw in the case of Rox, the magic circle being another one of them, and then of course also two-turn demon beasts, which is exactly what we saw with the Elbathian giants. But now that we've considered how the power works, what sort of conditions or limitations could apply, we still have to figure out, how do we actually defeat it? Now there is the idea floating around that Rox could actually show us in the next couple of chapters how someone with strong enough willpower can actually withstand Imu's control. After all, the fact that Domi Reversi is being shown both in the flashback and being used in the present suggests one of two things. One, there's going to be a clue within the God Valley flashback as to how to best it, or two, the Straw Hats are going to be the ones to figure out a solution that not even Garp or Roger or Rox could solve. And I do have to say, I personally think that it's going to be the latter, because chances are we're being shown Rox being turned as a prelude to Harold also suffering the same fate 14 years ago, which is why his soldiers killed him, or vice versa, his soldiers were turned after being Domi Reversi'd and that's why they killed their king. Regardless, we also have to remember that after meeting Imu, Rox set out for two very specific devil fruits. And I have shared my thoughts before that I think these are the Nika devil fruit and the Yami Yami no Mi. And that's when we start looking at Luffy and Blackbeard. Back in chapter 441, Blackbeard tells Ace that his darkness can suck in devil fruit powers. Long before armament haki was even a part of the conversation, Blackbeard's abilities were already shown overwriting devil fruit rules. But what's especially interesting is the original Japanese wording. While Oda uses the same kanji for devil, Blackbeard doesn't specifically say devil fruit. He specifically calls it sucking in the devil's power. And I think that subtle difference opens up that dialogue for interpretation. And if we think about it in the context of how Imu has been presented to literally look like the devil with demon-coded abilities, then this may have been Oda foreshadowing Imu's weakness all the way back in 2007. Because if Imu is indeed the devil in question, then Blackbeard's power may just be the answer to it. And the reason why Blackbeard was so keen on finding the Yami Yami no Mi is likely because he was inspired by his father's original plan, Rox being the one who figured out Imu's weakness, although he wasn't successful in finding the fruit itself. And like I said, I have shared my thoughts in detail in another video, so feel free to check that out. But for the context of today's discussion, I think Rox was planning on getting the Yami Yami no Mi for himself, while he also planned on acquiring the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, and he planned on asking Harold to eat that one. And in that other video, I do explain in full why I think that the legendary Abarthian devil fruit is the Nika devil fruit, and also why I think Harold eating it would maximize its full potential. Because Imu's defeat almost certainly hinges on Luffy's ability as Joy Boy. Imu was afraid of Joy Boy's haki. I mean, yes, Joy Boy was said to have lost, but he at least left a deep mark on Imu, as we have clearly seen. Imu was shown visibly shaking in the Egghead Island arc after sensing Joy Boy's ancient haki stored inside Emmet. And if that alone was enough to make Imu shake, then imagine what the real Joy Boy could have done, and how close Joy Boy must have come to crushing Imu. If the condition to the Domi Reversi really is about flanking your opponent, whether that be physically or psychologically, a devil fruit that practically, and I guess in some ways, quite literally bends reality, or lends its user the power of laughter, of constant joy. There's various reasons and ways how Joy Boy could have remained immune to Imu. And then add the idea of Luffy's moniker, the Warrior of Liberation, which as a concept is directly opposed to what Domi Reversi represents. The removal of freedom and control. And when you look at those two forces side by side, you can already start to see how Oda is setting up this ideological battle. A power that can absorb the devil, working alongside a power that represents absolute freedom from control. Not to mention the visual metaphor that's in play when you put two Ds together to form one circle, but also the imagery of the eclipse. Luffy's sun alongside Blackbeard's darkness. This for me almost confirms that Luffy and Blackbeard will team up to defeat Imu together. A massive moment considering that they themselves are enemies. But in a poetic twist of fate that saw the so-called enemies Garp and Roger team up at God Valley, Luffy and Blackbeard will be forced to do the same against their true enemy Imu. At least before Luffy and Blackbeard have their ultimate showdown between themselves. But first, an epic combined effort to take down Imu, a world that neither of them wants. So there you have it. Those are some of my thoughts on Imu's Domi Reversi, how it works, how it can be limited, how to defeat it. But I'd love to hear what you think, so let me know by leaving a comment below. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please like the video, share the video, and please do subscribe for more One Piece discussions, and also to help out a fellow One Piece fan get to 100,000 subscribers. You can also support the channel by becoming a Patreon or channel member like these wonderful people. But as always, thank you for listening to another one of my crazy One Piece ramblings. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.